Okay, just about noon here. We'll give it another couple of minutes just to let some folks join the meeting who may be signing on right now. As always, if you're not familiar with Zoom, you know that first time can be a little bit tricky getting your audio settings and everything sorted out. So we'll give those folks just another minute, and then we'll kick things off. I'm not seeing that we have Bill Campbell with us just yet. Oh, there he is. Looks like Bill's signing in now.
Hi, Will. How are you?
Bill, doing great. How are you today?
Great.
All right. Let's see. I'm seeing the group of attendees trickling in now, so I think we can probably go ahead and kick things off whenever you're ready.
Awesome. Thank you. Let's see. Hi, I'm Bill Campbell with Campbell Property Management. I'd like to welcome everybody. Thanks for taking your time today to join us for this virtual continuing education course on the Reserve Study, a roadmap for managers. Certainly an important and a complicated issue, which Will does a great job handling. Campbell Property Management and Will Simons from Association Reserves are very, very happy to bring you this important course today. Our staff of over 800 are privileged to be serving over 400 communities between Aventura and Port St. Lucie. With offices in Dade, Broward, and Palm Beach, Martin, and Brevard counties, we are very, very happy to be helping you out. Your manager's making this convenient for you today. I think we may have a few board members as well. I think we got over 170 people joining us, which is great. We appreciate any feedback you can give us on what you like to hear, what types of things you like, how good a job this is and how helpful it is for you, or the time, etc. We're here to help you and serve the community. So at the end, just take your time, please, and fill out that survey. At this time, I'd like to welcome Will Simons from Association Reserves, who's going to be putting the course on for us, and very, very informative and educational. So, Will, thank you for doing this for us, and we really appreciate it, and take it away.
Okay, thanks, Bill. I appreciate it. And thanks again to Campbell Property Management for the opportunity. Thanks to Bill. Thanks to Ashley. I know you guys are putting in a lot of work to get these going, and that really shows in the amount of turnout that we're getting here. I think for today we had something like 350 registrations, and it looks like more than half of those are in attendance today, so that's great. Just to let everybody know, the class today is somewhat of a part two. I taught a class last week called Fundamentals of Reserves. If you missed that class, don't worry. We do have that recorded that is posted online to YouTube. So what we're going to do there is when we send out the follow-up emails for today's class, I'll include a link to that original one as well. So if you missed that one, that's totally fine. I'm going to recap a little bit of some of the same material again today. But that will be available for you to watch sometime in the next couple of days. Now, just out of curiosity, I want to try something. I haven't done this before, but I want to see if we can get you guys to raise your hands out there. I want to just see how many in today's audience were also with us last week, either live or if you've since watched the recording. So if you can do me a favor, down in the bottom of your Zoom taskbar, there should be a button that says Participants. Now, if you click Participants, that should open a little sidebar window, I think, to the right of your screen. And down there, it should say Raise Hand. So I'm going to try to follow along with this on my side. If you guys can just give that a shot, see if we can do that Raise Hand feature. And just curious to see how many people were in attendance last time or have at least seen that material. Okay, great. So that number keeps climbing. We're over 100 out of 190 attendees on the line right now. Looks like we're 103, 104 or so that made it. So more than half. That's great. That's fantastic. But again, if you missed it last time, don't worry about it. You'll be able to see that information. So now you can go ahead and lower those hands, and maybe we'll try that again later on. So thanks for doing that. Okay, today's class, just to get into the material, again, should run about 50 minutes or so, same as last time. We will have Q&A at the end. Last time we did about 25, 30 minutes or so of Q&A. I did get some preliminary questions again this time around, although not as many as last time. So my hope is that we'll be able to get through any questions that you guys submit. If we don't, then I'm going to leave my email address up on the screen at the end. Feel free to send me an email with any follow-up questions that we may not get to today. Okay. Let's see, the way that you do that, if you're not familiar, again, down in that Zoom taskbar, there's a Q&A button. So if you click that during the course of the class, you can submit a question anytime. I'm not going to answer those on the fly, but we'll go down the list at the end of the class and run through those. If you need to leave at the end of the class, that's totally fine. Feel free to leave at the end of the hour. And you know, if you can't get to the Q&A, that's going to be part of the recording as well. So you will be able to catch up on that later. Okay, I think that's about it. For the managers out there, same as last time, we'll be submitting your hour of credit to the DBPR as soon as we can. I think last week we did it within 48 hours or so, but we're still waiting on confirmation to know if those were received on their end successfully. Said the same thing last week. I think they're basically short-staffed due to COVID, so things are just taking a little bit longer than normal, but we appreciate your patience on that. So without further ado, I'm going to shut off my camera. Everybody should be able to see my screen now. So I'll stop my video here in just a moment. I'll come back on at the end of the class, but between now and then, enjoy. Hope you all learned something useful today, and we'll get this going. Okay. All right, so before we get this going, I'll just do a little bit more housekeeping. Just to make it official, this course is called Reserve Study Roadmap for Managers. It is approved for 1 hour of continuing education credit in either the insurance and financial management section or as an elective. So like we said last time, if you haven't already provided us with your first name, last name, and CAM license number, please be sure to do so. I don't think that should be an issue this time because we did have that as part of the registration form, so we should be all good there. Again, as I said last time, I certainly don't want to give the impression that despite the title that this class is only for managers. I know we've got a lot of board members, committee members, residents and communities out there, and my goal for you all today is that you come away better prepared to lead and serve your communities. So just like last time, we'll be happy to provide copies of the slides for today's presentation. I think we'll just preemptively do that for everyone, and feel free to pass those along to anybody else that you might like. Okay. So yeah, again, I guess just to reiterate, no need to request the slides. We'll go ahead and send those out to everybody automatically. Okay. All right, you'll have to bear with me a couple times during this presentation. Those of you who did join us last time, some of this is going to be redundant, but I'll just take the same steps here to introduce myself and our company. As I said, my name is Will Simons. I'm the president of the Florida office for Association Reserves. Been with the company since 2008. I've spent most of my career in Florida. We've had clients in Florida going back to the early 1990s. The RS after my name stands for Reserve Specialist. That's an industry-specific credential that's only awarded to people who have demonstrated expertise and experience in preparing reserve studies. I don't remember if I mentioned this last time, but personally I've either prepared or overseen our staff in the preparation of, at this point, it's got to be somewhere close to 2,000 reserve studies. So quite a few different types of properties in there. That RS credential is awarded by the Community Associations Institute, or CAI. There's only been a few hundred people to ever earn the credential over the last 20 years or so. I've lived in both condos and HOAs. I spent about 6 years serving as the treasurer of my own community in South Florida. We had a budget there of over $1 million, 635 home HOA community. The reason I point that out is because I always like to remind our volunteers out there, I know what it's like to be on your side of the table, right? I've worked with other volunteers and committees having to take on the responsibility of managing an association and helping to represent, you know, hundreds of people and many millions of dollars worth of property value. Association Reserves happens to be the oldest and largest reserve study provider in the United States. We've been in this business since 1986, and collectively we've completed tens of thousands of reserve studies for all different types of properties all around the world. We've we've got offices from coast to coast and more credentialed reserve specialists on staff than any other company. The majority of the work that we do is for community associations, naturally, which includes all types of condos, HOAs, timeshares, and other types of residential properties. But we also have a great deal of experience with other property types: office buildings, hotels, resort properties, worship facilities, you name it. Actually, I had a conversation yesterday with a gentleman who's a partner in a restaurant up in Tampa, and they were curious to know, well, what's the useful life of our walk-in refrigerator and our point of sale equipment and all the other kind of interior components of the restaurant. So it's just another great example of how this sort of planning can apply to many different types of properties. One thing I do always like to point out is that our only job as a company is preparing reserve studies. We're not an engineering firm or an accounting firm, but rather a specialized consulting firm that's focused on doing one thing really well, and that is to guide our clients towards a successful financial future. The way that we do that is by preparing accurate and reliable reserve studies that will help our clients to forecast and budget for major projects. So we feel that if we do our job well and our clients follow the plans that we help them to design, the benefit to them is that they're able to reduce the risk of special assessments and bank loans and other forms of financial distress. So if you want to get any additional information, you'll see down there in the bottom right-hand corner of the slide, our website is reservestudy.com. My email is wsimons@reservestudy.com. It's WSIMONS @reservestudy.com, and we will have that up on the screen at the end for you to write down as well. Okay, just going to give you a quick outline of what this course will cover today. This time around, we've got 3 sections. The first section is going to focus more on the philosophy, or maybe the reasoning behind why it's important to have reserves at all. In other words, why is it not okay for an association to just pass a special assessment or go out and get a loan every single time it needs to take on a big project? The next section is going to be a repeat of a portion that we talked about last time, which is this building block that we call percent funded. That's going to help us understand some of the metrics in reserve studies, and that will come into play in our last section. Once we understand percent funded, the heart of the course is going to be a detailed overview of the 2 different reserve funding methodologies. Those are called the pooled method and the straight line method. Okay, so we'll start with this, I think, fairly basic question, and that's just why have reserves at all? Okay. Now I'm going to put this in perspective. I'll pose this sort of hypothetical question to you guys out there. The question is, what are reserves for? Why do associations collect reserves? And is it for the here and now, or is it for the future? Okay, so maybe take a moment and ponder that for a second. Usually when I ask this question in a live setting, I ask everybody to give me a show of hands between the here and now and the future. And most of the time, more hands go up for the future. But I think this is a really critical, important point to make right off the bat. I want to just, reinforce that reserve funding is for the here and now. So if you let me explain, basically we think it's a misunderstanding to think of reserve funding as, saving up for some future project. Okay. And the reason why that's not a great approach is that there's oftentimes a very good chance that the current owners that live in an association won't be there by the time some future project takes place. Okay, so it seems to make sense on paper that if they won't be around to benefit from that project, they shouldn't be funding the reserves towards it in the present day. Okay, now I want to encourage you to think of this in a different way. Instead, if you think of reserve funding as paying the current bill of deterioration that is occurring in the present day, that's the more appropriate way to think of it. Okay, think of it more like a pay-as-you-go model. Let me give you a quick example here. Let's say that I buy a unit in a brand new condo building, and let's assume that it has a roof with a 20-year lifespan. Okay, now if I live there for the first 15 years of that building's existence, that means I'm going to enjoy 15 years of use and value out of that roof, not to mention all of the other building components, the mechanical systems, the amenities, and so on. Now, let's say that I want to sell my unit after those 15 years, and the incoming buyer plans to live there for the next 15 years, okay? But think about the math again, only 5 years after they buy my unit, because as a 20-year life, that roof is likely to need to be replaced. Now this is where it gets a little tricky. If I had not been charged accordingly during the time that I lived there, meaning I wasn't contributing towards the cost of the roof replacement through reserve funding, then the new buyer, the second buyer, is essentially going to get stuck with the full cost of the replacement. Okay. Now at that point, remember, they've only lived there for 5 years or 25% of the roof's life, but they're paying the full 20 years worth of cost in the event that I wasn't, being charged appropriately for reserves. They're paying their share of the life of the roof, but also my share, even though I've already moved away. And not to mention I got, the majority of the roof's life at that point. Now, the question is this, so what? Well, if you're the second buyer and you're deciding between associations to buy into, then the fact that my association doesn't have a healthy reserve fund means that you, as the new buyer, are going to be exposed to more cost and probably a higher chance of a special assessment in order to make up for the years during which I was not being charged for my share of the cost. Okay. In our business, we talk about these 4 reserve rules. First up, expenses are inevitable. There is absolutely no getting around the fact that your air conditioning system will need to be replaced, your elevators will need to be modernized, your roads will need to be repaved, and so on. Number 2, the board is always responsible. They are the ones entrusted with managing the community association on behalf of all the owners. Next up, when projects get delayed, they tend to get more expensive. And we see this all the time, especially in the case of things like roofs and concrete restoration, other building exterior components. Now, most importantly, the homeowners will always get stuck paying the bill. Okay, there's no Uncle Sam, there's no government bailout coming for those condo buildings that don't have adequate reserves, right? Just like there are 4 rules for reserve planning, there are only 4 options for how to eventually pay those bills. Okay, the first and best option, of course, is to have a healthy reserve fund. The second best option is to pass special assessments when those projects come along. Now, it should be obvious that it's a bad situation when the second best option has this skull and crossbones warning on it. And if you've ever managed or lived in a community that has recurring special assessments, you know exactly what I mean by that, right? It's a toxic thing for a community to go through. Okay, the next best option would be to take out a loan or a line of credit. The reason I have that one ranked after the special assessment is because, of course, the cost of the project in that case will be greater due to the financing portion of it. Now, what happens if you don't do any of those 3? Well, in that case, your only choice is to let the property fall into disrepair. Essentially, if you don't pay any money out of pocket up front to take care of it, then the only resulting conclusion is that you're going to have a decline in property values. Okay. These are some of the specific benefits of having reserve funds in the first place. So starting at the top, you shouldn't have any surprises, or at least a lower chance of getting caught by surprise. Okay, what we mean there is if you're funding reserves and you're paying attention, that means you're tracking the remaining life expectancies of your components. And that will give you the best menu of options to plan ahead and prepare for when they need to be replaced, rather than reacting and getting caught by surprise when something fails. Okay. When you're planning ahead, that also gives you the chance to shop around and select from different providers. Having time on your side will give you the ability to seek out more bids and hopefully try to minimize your costs by trying to work with those contractors. As a quick example, you might talk to your painting company and find out, is there a time of year where it's more advantageous to us to have these buildings painted? Do you guys have a slow season? On the flip side, if you're calling out to those contractors on an emergency basis because, as an example, your cooling tower just failed and it's the 4th of July, well, now you're going to get stuck paying a much higher cost for that project because it's a rush. It's an emergency at that point. The last, or the bottom point there about minimizing exposure, that's mostly relevant to the board members out there. Okay, so what I mean here is that if you're proactively taking care of the property, that means you're doing a better job of upholding your fiduciary duty, which will give you better protection against any complaints, any lawsuits that the owners might bring. Lastly, the last point there is that if you're doing all of these 3 things, that should naturally lead to increasing property values. what we've seen in our experience is that communities that are doing a good job of reserve funding tend to have better curb appeal. They're more up to date with respect to technology. They have more modern amenities than those that don't. And again, all of that contributes to a better ownership experience, both for the people who live there now, but also making those properties more attractive to potential buyers down the road. Okay, of course, the opposites are true if you don't have a healthy reserve fund. You're going to be more exposed to surprises, which can then lead to higher expenses, which in turn can be more liability exposure, and in the worst case, a declining property value. The real issue that we see in these cases is that when the communities get into this, vicious cycle, it becomes very, very difficult to break out of it. Okay, that's the end of our first section there. As I said at the top, this portion here, percent funded, is going to be a repeat for some of the folks that saw the first class, Fundamentals of Reserves. But I don't think this is a waste of time. I think it's such an important concept that going over it a second time will only reinforce it. So just bear with me. If you've already seen this before, maybe you'll pick up on something that you did in the first time around. But again, percent fund is one of the most important concepts for us to understand because it gives us a reliable and consistent way to measure the strength of any association's reserve account at any point in time. Okay, sometimes I describe percent funded as sort of taking a snapshot in time of financial strength because it helps us to evaluate how well an association is doing with respect to reserve funding in the present day, even though many of those projects they're saving for may not be coming due for many years. Fundamentally, we think of this as a way to measure risk. Specifically, what we mean there is risk of financial problems such as special assessments and bank loans. The last point on the slide here is that percent funded is not fixed. It will fluctuate in time based on your cash flow. Okay, so if you're contributing to your reserves in a healthy, appropriate way, hopefully the result is that percent funded will be increasing over time, which in turn means that that association is becoming better prepared to pay for its major components. Okay, that risk is going down as percent funded is going up. All right, again, one of the best ways that I think to explain percent funded is to use the analogy of a credit score. We've all had our credit reports pulled. We all know what the score should be. To an outside party like a bank or a credit card company, your credit score is just an indicator of what kind of risk you might be. Okay, so in the same way, if you think of the reserve study itself like a credit report, and then you have to distill it down to one key result, that result would be percent funded. Okay, we measure it on a 0 to 100% scale, and we consider anything between 0 and 30% to be a weak position. In that range, the association is going to have a higher likelihood of special assessments and cash flow problems. Once the community is above 30% funded, we consider that to be the start of more of a fair range, more moderate risk there. Not an emergency anymore, but there's still some room for improvement. However, where you really want to be as a community is above 70% funded. That's where we see the lowest statistical risk of those types of cash flow problems. Okay, we talked about it as a concept. Now we'll go through those steps of calculating percent funded. Again, fairly simple idea. All we're going to do is look at how much money an association has at some point in time, and then compare that amount against how much money it should have at the same point in time. And we just divide those by each other and express that comparison as a percentage. Okay, so the first part, how much money do you have? Pretty straightforward. All we do there is look at the current financial statements for the property and try to look forward. You know, how much will they have at the beginning of the next fiscal year that we're going to cover in this year's budget, to try to figure out how much money will be there in the bank at that point in time. Second part, how much money they should have. This idea, this concept of how much a community should have at some point in time, that is a dollar amount that we call the fully funded balance. Okay. The way that I like to explain this, I always say, first of all, the fully funded balance is a theoretical number. And the way I put it in perspective is this: if I tell you that an association has $50,000 in reserves, but you don't know anything else about the community, anything about what type of property is, how many people live there, does that mean anything? Have we really told you anything at all? right? And I'll hear this sort of thing all the time from board members. Someone might say to me, for example, hey, our association's in great shape. We have $900,000 in reserves. We have 1.2 million in reserves. But again, I have to point out to them, yeah, that's a ton of money. That sounds like a lot of money, but we don't know if it's adequate unless you have something else to compare it against. Okay. So, of course, that's all going to depend on what type of property we're talking about. If it's a little two-story building, like the photo on the left here, no amenities, just a little parking lot, it could be that $50,000 is plenty of money for that type of property. But if we're dealing with a luxury high-rise building, you know, you high-rise managers out there, you board members, you know that $50,000 is nothing. That's a drop in the bucket, and that can be wiped out in one payment towards one project. You know, regardless of anything else that might else be on the list there. Okay, let's take this one step further. How do we actually calculate the fully funded balance is a fairly simple idea. Basically, we're just looking at how old the component is compared to its overall lifespan, which will give us a fraction. We then multiply that fraction by the current estimated cost of that component, which will tell us how much money we should have today for its eventual replacement. Now, when we do a reserve study, it doesn't matter if the association has 4 components or 400. We're just going to calculate the fully funded balance for each one and then add all those numbers together, which will tell us the fully funded balance for the whole association. Okay. Now, once we've done that, then we have something we can use to look at the cash on hand and put that amount in perspective. Okay, so just like last time, we're going to do this example. Again, pretending that we're on the board or we're the manager of this, you know, hypothetical community, Seaview Condominiums, and our task is to calculate percent funded for this community at the start of this upcoming fiscal year. All right. So again, step one, we're going to establish the starting reserve balance. Let's say we've looked at our financial statements, we talked to our bookkeeper, our CPA, we've taken into account any projected spending that we're going to have this year. We know how much we're putting into the reserves because we have our budget already for this year. And that will leave us with a starting position of, let's say, $60,000 going into 2021. Okay, the next thing we need to do is to calculate the fully funded balance for each of our components. And for the sake of the example, that's just going to be 3 things. First up, we'll look at the roof. And let's say the roof is 10 years old with a useful life of 20 years. Let's give it an estimated replacement cost of $80,000. Now again, keep in mind that the fully funded balance is only the proportion of the cost that we need to have on hand today. Okay, so since the roof is halfway through its life, in theory, you only need to have half of the replacement cost saved up now because you know you have another 10 years to collect the difference. So with these numbers, we'll take 10 over 20 and we'll multiply that by $80,000, which tells us that the theoretical fully funded balance for the roof as of right now is $40,000. Okay, it's halfway through its life. We only need to have half of the replacement cost saved up today. Okay, our next example, let's say we're doing the same calculations for our gym equipment. And if now we assume that the equipment is 5 years old with an overall useful life of 15 years and a replacement cost of $30,000, well, then we know that the fully funded balance for that equipment right now should be $10,000. Okay, makes sense. It's only 1/3 of the way through its life, so we only theoretically need to have 1/3 of the replacement cost in the bank today. Okay, let's do our last one here. Let's say that we have painted the hallways of the building 2 years ago, and we want to do that every 8 years. And let's say that our cost estimate for that is $100,000. We'll take 2 divided by 8, so it's 1/4 or 25% of the way through its life cycle. And if the cost estimate is $100,000 now, then we know that the fully funded balance for hallway painting should be $25,000. Okay. Not so bad. We've done the calculations for our starting reserve balance, and now that we have calculated the individual fully funded balances by component, now we can calculate percent funded for the entire association. Okay, we'll look something like this. We'll take the 3 numbers and add those together. So $40,000 for the roof, $10,000 for the gym equipment, and $25,000 for painting. Combine those 3 together, you get the theoretical fully funded balance of $75,000. Now that we've done that, now we can look back at the $60,000 in cash that we're going to have, and we can make a determination that this community is 80% funded. Okay. Now, before we move on, again, we'll just talk about for a moment how we can start to draw some financial conclusions about communities using percent funded. What you're looking at here is the result of a very large internal analysis that our company did a number of years ago. In this case, we were looking at a data set of thousands of associations, and we were measuring two variables. First one was this: what was the percent funded level? And secondly, did we need, excuse me, did we need to include a special assessment recommendation as part of the funding plan for that property? And the results we found were pretty obvious, pretty consistent with what we had expected we would find. Basically, the closer the associations were to 0% funded, the higher the chances that they would need an immediate special assessment as part of that funding plan going forward. Okay. A few years later, we did another internal study. This time around, we were looking to see if there was a correlation between percent funded for an association and the actual property values of the homes within those associations. The way we did this one was, again, looking at a large data set. This time it was from a single metropolitan area in Southern California. We selected a group of properties, I believe it was a couple hundred properties, that were all as similar as we could make them in terms of size, age, amenities, and so on. The next step was to measure the market value of the homes in those communities to see what difference it made when the associations themselves were in a better financial position. So to be specific, what we wanted to know was what type of increase would we see in property value when an association was in a better financial position with respect to percent funded. First thing we did was to set a baseline, which we defined as those communities that were in a weak spot, again, between 0 and 30% funded, but then measuring and comparing against the properties that were between 30 and 70% funded. So again, all else being as equal as possible, what we found was that in the communities that were in a fair position, the homes there were about 8% more valuable than those in the weak associations. Okay, now even more interesting than that, the associations that were in a strong position above 70% funded saw an almost 13% gain in property value compared to those that were in that baseline, that weak position. Now, intuitively, you can sort of see how that would be the case, right? The associations that have money in the bank tend to have better curb appeal. They're in better physical condition, more modern amenities, mechanical systems, more energy efficiency, all of those good things that translates into those being more attractive to potential buyers. So if you go back to that initial question we started with, why have reserves? One answer is that it can really come back to you in the form of higher property value. So just as an exercise, you guys think of your own situation out there. Wherever you live, if you could have a 13% gain in property value because your association is in a strong position compared to a weak one, think about what that might do to your bottom line. Okay. All right, now here's for the last and I think most important portion of the class. I know this is the one that usually gets the most attention, the most questions. We're going to talk now about the two different ways that associations calculate reserve funding. Okay. First up, I'm going to go over what's called the straight line method. Now, the other term for this method is called the component method. And the reason being is that all components in this method are treated separately from one another from a funding standpoint. I always describe this as the old-fashioned way. More and more communities are switching over to the pooled method. Part of the reason it's the old-fashioned way is because prior to 2002, at least in the state of Florida, it was the only approved method. Okay, so the way that I try to characterize this one is that it is simple in theory, but it becomes very troublesome, problematic when you actually try to use it and put it in practice. And I hear this all the time from boards, from managers, from CPAs. Seems to be pretty unanimous that this one is kind of becoming outdated very quickly. But let's talk it through. So if you want to understand this method, I think it's helpful if you think of each category of reserve funds as being handled in these separate buckets, okay? So for now, let's assume that we're talking about just 5 buckets of money. We'll have roof, elevator, painting, mechanical, and pavement, okay? When you're using this method, you determine the amount of funding going into each bucket, each reserve category each year, using a pretty simple calculation. Basically, all you're going to do is to take the cost of a component, subtract out any existing funds that are already saved for that component, and you divide the remaining difference by the remaining useful life of that component. Okay, and then the result of that calculation will tell you the amount required to, quote, fully fund that component in the following year's budget. Okay, let's use the roof reserve, or the roof bucket, if you will, as our first example. Now, in this case, if you understand that the total volume of the bucket, okay, the total capacity here represents the full cost to replace the roof. And if you look at the existing reserves as being the contents of the bucket, then the empty portion here would be something that we might call the unfunded balance. Okay, that's just the difference between the total cost of replacement and the sum of the existing money that's already in the bank. Okay. If we put some actual numbers on this, we can say that, let's say the cost to replace the roof is $200,000, and we've already got $140,000 in our roof reserves. So that would mean then that there's an unfunded balance, right? The difference between the two of $60,000. Okay. In order for me to determine how much I need to be funding my roof reserve going forward, I'm going to take my $200,000 cost, I'm going to subtract the $140,000 in existing reserves and divide the difference over the remaining useful life of the roof, which for the sake of this example, we'll say is 3 years. Okay, so I'll take $200,000 minus $140,000. I get that $60,000 number, which I then divide by 3 years, meaning I need to put $20,000 a year into my reserves for the next 3 years in order to fully fund my roof. Right? Makes sense. At the end of the roof's life, we want to have fully accumulated its complete replacement cost. In order to do the rest of the budget, I'm going to go through and repeat the same process for each of those remaining buckets, those remaining categories. Okay? Pretty straightforward type of math you can do on the back of an envelope. Now, let's start to break this down a little bit. These are some of the problems that we've discovered and that our clients have discovered when they use this method. First one is this. What happens if you have multiple components that could all fall under the same category or in the same bucket, but that have different remaining useful lives? So in that case, which remaining life expectancy would you use in your calculations? Okay, just to give you an example, let's think about a property that's maybe a townhome community. And you could have a flat roof on your clubhouse, but tile roofs on all of your residential buildings. Now you should know these two types of roofs will have different life expectancies. Okay. Going back to that example, we can use some of the same numbers, but what do we do here if we have two roofs but only one roof reserve category? Let's say that the clubhouse roof has a remaining life of 3 years, but the residential buildings have a remaining life of 10 years. In this case, which one do you use in your calculation? Okay, it's not an obvious, easy answer, is it? Problem number 2. What happens if you've identified components that definitely need to be replaced, but you don't have any reserve money for them? Okay, this happens all the time when we do reserve studies. We'll look at an existing budget, maybe that was initially created by the developer of the property, but if it didn't consider everything that it should have, what happens in those cases? What if there's no existing reserve account for something like, balcony railings, windows and doors, lobby remodeling, swimming pool? None of those fit into those existing buckets. Okay. Problem number 3, and this is probably the one that we see the most often. In this case, the question is, what do you have, or what do you do rather, if you have a shortfall in reserves in one account and a surplus in another? Okay, here's an example of what that might look like. Let's say you've got a ton of money sitting in this pavement reserve fund here, but a relatively low amount in your mechanical reserves. Now, if we look at any given property, you might have to ask yourselves, what's more important? Can we move money from one place to another if there's a project that's more urgent? Obviously in Florida, something like a cooling tower replacement should be a higher priority than repaving the parking lot. Okay, we all know you can live for years with an ugly old, busted up parking lot, but you may not make it more than a couple of days without proper air conditioning, especially this time of year. But in this case, you can't just take the money from your pavement reserves and spend it on your new cooling tower. At least it's not an easy process. Here's why. In reality, you have to get a vote of the owners to do that. Okay, so just for background, basically when the accounts were set up, the logic was that they were intended to be used for specific purposes. And to use money from one category to spend it on another category is considered a non-scheduled use of those funds, and that has to be approved by a majority of the owners in the association. Now, if you ask yourselves if it's easy to get a majority vote to do anything in an association, in our experience and from what our clients tell us, absolutely not. Not to mention that has to happen every single time you want to move money from one place to another. Now remember, even if you're able to get the approval to do so, you're just leaving the other account underfunded now until some future date when you're likely to have to move money back into it from someplace else. So it's just this kind of game of musical chairs. You just end up constantly borrowing from Peter to pay Paul. And again, you know, you guys know out there that getting that majority vote, I think, is the hardest part. I think in reality, most of the owners would tend to approve it, would see that that's a reasonable thing to do. But when you can't get a quorum, you can't get the participation of the owners, in reality, it's going to be very, very difficult. Okay, some of the additional problems that we find with that straight line method, because the method only considers one fiscal year at a time, there's no way to account for any interest or inflation, and those will definitely be playing a role over the long term. There's also no way to tell if the association is getting better or getting worse, right? We don't know if they're trending up or trending down. Probably the most relevant problem with this method, the one that matters the most to most properties, is that because it's not the most efficient use of all of the available money, it will end up costing the owners in the association more money to fund reserves when you're doing it this way. Okay. The good news is that there is a better option. We call it the pooled method. It's also known as the cash flow method. And in our opinion, it's just the better way to go. And when I say our, I'm not just talking about me or our company. When I teach this class for CPAs, when I talk to property managers, again, it seems pretty unanimous. You know, other reserve study providers are pretty much all of the same mind that the pooled method is preferable. Just for a bit of background, the method has, again, it's only been approved in Florida since 2002. But I can tell you that because we're a national company, outside of Florida, this method is pretty much universal. When I started my career with our company out in California, I actually had to learn how to do the straight line method before I left for Florida because it's just really not used anywhere else. So again, comparing it to that other one, to the straight line method, to me, the pooled method is more complex in theory, but once you understand it, actually becomes much simpler to use for budgeting. Okay, sticking with that same analogy, the best way I found to explain the pooled method is that you're going to take all of those buckets and you'll just dump them into one big bathtub. Okay, that's essentially the metaphorical process of pooling your reserves. Now, once you do that, you've essentially removed the labels from any specific categories of reserve funds. Now, all of the reserve money is collectively available for any component that's on the list. So in other words, there's no such thing anymore as a roof reserve dollar or a painting reserve dollar or an elevator dollar. It is all just reserve money that can be spent much more effectively and efficiently. Okay. I'm going to talk through the process of how you develop the reserve budget using this pooled method, but keep in mind the first step of the process is exactly the same whichever method you're using. The foundation of any good budget, any good reserve plan has to be an accurate component list. Now, we talked about this a lot in the prior class, the fundamentals class. How do we go through the process of developing that component list? So again, if you haven't seen that one, highly encourage you to go back and watch that. But let's say you've done that, you have identified all the things in the community, you have all of the cost estimates, all the life expectancies that go with them. Now what you're able to do is you can look forward and design a timeline of expenses. Okay. Most reserve studies, most reserve schedules will include a 30-year forecast. Might look something like this. And in this case, we can show what approximate amounts are going to be spent in any given fiscal year, right? We can start to model the future. That's driven by the timeline of repeating expenses, you know, which again, the underlying useful life and remaining useful life estimates will determine which years those projects happen. With respect to the costs, now another advantage here is that we can include inflation, because we can try and forecast what something will be or what it will cost in the future when the work actually gets done. So generally speaking, you should see kind of a trending upwards of those expenses, of those costs over time. Okay. Once we know what the future expenditures should look like, the next logical step is to determine how much money will need to go into that reserve account in order to meet those expenses. Okay, it's a fairly straightforward process, but I'll walk you through the steps. The first thing that we need to do is determine the sum total of our reserve funds at the start of the fiscal year. Right, we saw that a couple slides back in that percent funded section. The next step we're going to do is we'll plug in an amount for estimated income to our reserve account, which can be a combination of contributions, but also interest earnings. Okay, so notice that we already have a nice advantage over the straight line method, which can't actively apply interest earnings toward your overall income assumption. The next step we'll do is to go back to that forecast of expenses, and we look at what the estimated costs will be or what will be on the schedule for that year. Okay. From there, you're just going to do the math, right? You have your starting cash position, you add in your assumption of reserve income, you subtract out your reserve expenses, and you see where that leaves the account balance going into the following year. Hopefully by now you're getting a sense of why this is also called the cash flow method. Now, when you look at the start of that second year, that next year, obviously you'll have to make sure that you still have some money in the bank, okay? If you don't, then you'll have to go back to step one, use a higher contribution rate for that initial year, because we're never allowed to design a plan that would have the association going below zero. We'll talk about that option more in just a moment. The beauty of doing this process using an Excel spreadsheet or some kind of software is that you can model the same types of projections for many, many years at a time. So it might only take a few seconds, a few minutes to set up those formulas, but those will help to show you how much money you'll be spending over the remaining years, and therefore how much money you'll need to be contributing over those years, always keeping your account balance at a safe level. Okay. Which leads me to a very important point. There are certainly differences of opinion over what is considered to be a safe level. Basically, there are three possible funding objectives. Okay, you've got full funding, threshold funding, and baseline funding, which will break down in that order. Okay, the most conservative option here is called full funding or fully funding your reserves. And I want to be very careful here. When I use the term full funding in the context of a pooled reserve account, I'm using the definition that comes from National Reserve Study Standards. Now, that definition states that full funding means you're setting an objective to attain and maintain your reserves at or near 100% funded. So again, this is why it's so important that we understand that building block concept of percent funded. If you look at this table here, you will see a real world example of what full funding looks like. And keep in mind, we're going to email the PDF slides of this, so you'll be able to stop and look at this in close detail. But let's start at the top left corner of the table. The first column on the left shows all 30 years of the financial plan from top to bottom, okay, right here. Moving from left to right, okay, now we're going left to right, you'll see different numbers corresponding to each fiscal year. Okay, we've got your starting reserve balance, the fully funded reserve balance as of that year, which we can then use to calculate percent funded. Now that we know what different levels of percent funded mean in terms of risk, we can make a determination of whether that's a low, medium, or high risk position. Moving to the right, the next column is the reserve contributions for that fiscal year. Okay, we then have a column showing the annual percentage increase in contributions over the prior year. Next, we've got a column showing whether there's any need for loans or special assessments. Moving again to the right, we show if there's any projected interest income for that year. And then finally, we have the reserve expenses in that fiscal year. Okay, with the benefit of a nice spreadsheet like this, you can start to do some math pretty quickly. If you just look at the first year in this example, we have a starting reserve balance of 2.1 million. Okay, we're then going to compare that against our theoretical fully funded balance here, which is a little over 2.5 million. That means this association has a starting position of 83.8% funded. Okay. What we then do is design a plan to attain and maintain that position of being 100% funded. It's very important to understand that the reserve expenses on the far right column, okay, over here, those are fixed. Okay. We know that our starting point is 83.8% funded. We know that the expenses are what they are. So now we just need to know that our contributions we set up in this plan will be enough to not only cover the expenses, but hopefully start increasing the reserve balance relative to the fully funded balance, which we know is the definition of an increasing percent funded. And that's what you see here. You see this nice gain, again, starting 84%. You see this slow, steady, gradual increase up to 100% by the end of the plan. Okay, this is a chart showing the same data, but in a different way. The green dots here represent percent funded over time, and of course we see that nice gradual increase. This is what fully funding looks like when you're using the pooled method. Okay, again, the goal here is to become 100% funded over time. Doesn't mean you have to get there overnight. It's a nice, steady, gradual increase over time. Okay, the next possible objective when you're designing a funding plan like this is to set a goal based on what is called threshold funding. Essentially, in this case, you pick a target and then you design your funding plan accordingly. So as an example, you could say, instead of becoming 100% funded, we just want to become 70% funded. Or another way to go about it could be, we just want to make sure that we never drop below $1 million in our pooled reserve fund. One of the problems with this approach, I feel, is that it's more subjective. Okay, as an example, you could have a board in 1 year that decides they want the threshold to be 50% funded, but then next year you've got a new board, and once they're in place, they say, no, we want the threshold to be 20% funded. That's going to have a huge effect on the amount of funding required to hit either of those two targets. Okay. Let's look at it this way. This is a chart where we've used the same starting point as we saw in our prior example for full funding. Again, 83.8% funded, and we're using the same forecasted expenses. Again, remember, those won't change no matter which objective you're using. The only thing that changes is the amount of funding required to hit a certain objective. So in this case, we designed that objective to be a threshold funding goal of 70% funded. And if you look in the percent funded column here, kind of in the center of the table, fourth one from the left, you'll see that even though you have the same starting position of 83.8% funded, that number actually decreases over time, getting to a point near the end where it does actually drop down to that 70% funded level. At that point, of course, the association is still in a low risk position, but as we know from those examples earlier, the lower the percent funded, the higher the likelihood of financial problems. Okay. Now, if you were to look closely, and I encourage you to do this when you have the slides, you'll see that the required reserve contributions to meet this objective are lower than the full funding, but really not by very much at all. Okay. This is, again, same data, but a different chart. If we look at percent funded in this example, again, same starting point, just under 84% funded, but that's going to bounce along in the 80s, eventually getting down into the 70s over time. Now, we'll talk about the last objective, which is called baseline funding. Now, I don't want to mince words here. This is the riskiest option on the table. Basically, the idea here is that you're figuring out how much is the bare minimum amount of money that we need to put into reserves to keep our account balance above zero throughout the entire timeline. Again, we're assuming the same level of expenses no matter the objective, but in this case, you're solving for a number that just barely allows you to meet those expenses. And here's my big problem with this plan, with this objective. The state of Florida in statutes and civil code has made the determination that baseline funding can be considered sufficient funds, okay? In fact, the DBPR has a manual that they publish, which is a guide for managers and board members, which explains how to do a pooled funding calculation. In that example that they show in the manual, the association in question gets to a point where they only have $4 in their reserve account, and the state would still call this, quote unquote, sufficient. Now, let me stop and I'll just ask it as a rhetorical question. Does anybody out there, whether you're a board member or a manager, would you ever think that it's a good idea for an association to have only $4 in its reserve account? Obviously, we don't think so, and I hope you all recognize that's a very dangerous approach to take. Obviously, if you're just doing the bare minimum, it only takes one problem to completely blow up that plan. That could be some project happening a little earlier than you thought or costing a little bit more money than you thought. But the point is that if you're trying to thread the needle that closely, you have no margin for error. And the chances that you'll need to pass special assessments or go out and get those loans will become very, very high the closer you are to zero, the closer you are to that baseline objective. And again, if one of the main reasons to fund reserves at all is to try and prevent that from happening, well, then I don't know how you could ever consider that this is a reasonable or appropriate strategy. All right, just to show you where this comes from, this is the actual language that's published in our Florida legislation with respect to pooled funding. Okay, basically says that the contribution rate needs to be enough so that over time your cash inflows are greater than your cash outflows, but that's it. There's no other requirements to go with it. Okay, if we looked at it this way, using our tables, we can see what a baseline funding plan would look like. As before, same starting position, same expenses, but this time around we're figuring out how much of a contribution rate is required, basically just to meet those expenses and keep the starting reserve balance above zero. So what you see in this plan is that, again, even though they're starting from that same strong position, 84% funded, they're not contributing enough money over time to sustain that position. Okay, percent funded is gradually decreasing from strong to weak. In this example, they actually get to a point towards the end of the timeline where they only have about $5,000 in the bank. Way down here, it's way out in the year 2046. But if you look closely, just to the right of that, at the same time, their fully funded balance is over $11 million. So just to reiterate, again, the state would say that this is sufficient reserves, but hopefully by now you should know that if you should have over $11 million in the bank and you only actually have $5,000 in the bank, that's a pretty lousy situation. You're going to be in deep trouble at that point. No surprises here. You get the idea. Again, starting at a strong position, but only doing the bare minimum required to keep that account balance positive. So percent funded is decreasing all along the way. Now, in reality, this is just a portrayal of an association digging themselves into a financial hole that's going to be very, very difficult to climb out of. Okay, so one of the most common questions that I get when I give this presentation is if we have the straight line method now, okay, but we're interested in switching to the pooled method, how do we do that? So I added in this slide to kind of talk through that process. First and foremost, a board can create a new pooled account all by itself. So for example, the board can say that, as of this upcoming fiscal year, all of our new incoming reserve money will be going into this pool of funds that we've just created. That itself does not require any ownership vote. However, if the board wants to move money from the existing straight line accounts, remember, think of our old buckets, into the new pooled account, that does require the owners to vote and approve it. Okay, it's basically the same idea as moving funds from one bucket account to another. It's considered a non-scheduled use of those funds, and so the same voting process is required as if you were moving money from your painting reserves to your elevator reserves. The good news is that that's a one-time process. It's not like you have to take the vote every year when you adopt your budget. And then the last step here is, whenever you're considering this, I would highly recommend that you involve your association CPA, maybe even get your attorney involved to make sure that you're going through those steps correctly. Of course, if you have a reserve study provider, you probably want to involve them as well. Just make sure you're totally understanding all the calculations that go into that process. Okay, before we wrap this up, we're going to open this up for Q&A in just a moment. I'm going to leave you with a couple parting thoughts. So I feel like if I've done my job today, hopefully first you'll agree that reserves are incredibly important for associations, both in the present and in the future. And when you're designing your annual budgets, we would encourage you to think hard and choose wisely about which method you want to use to do that. Once you've chosen that method, particularly if you want to pool your reserves, make a smart choice about what the long-term objective of that reserve plan should be. Okay, last point to make here, when you're designing those annual budgets, the goal should never be to simply just keep the dues low and keep the members happy. Okay, as leaders in the industry, whether you're a reserve specialist, a property manager, or a board member who's serving your community, it's our responsibility to educate the people that we represent and to help them to make those wise financial decisions. Okay, so we'll open this up for Q&A in just a moment. I've got, again, some list of preliminary questions that had come in. We'll take a pause here for just a couple minutes and give everybody a chance to submit any additional ones using that Q&A feature. And let's see. Go ahead and turn my video back on for you guys. My email address is now up on the screen, so feel free to use that, wsimons@reservestudy.com. So if we don't get to your question today, or if you think of something after the fact, feel free to let us know. I'll just start running through these questions. Again, if you need to drop off the line, that's okay. This is going to be part of the recording. So feel free if you've got another commitment to leave, but we'll try to get through as many of these as possible. So first question that I had preliminarily was this. The company that performed our most recent reserve study added some items that will eventually need to be replaced but are under $10,000. The board decided not to fund them but left them in the pooled schedule. Will these items now be eligible to use pooled funds? So I'm not entirely sure if I understand the question correctly here, but basically if your components are listed in your reserve schedule with a useful life, a remaining life, and a cost estimate, then they would be eligible to have funds from the entire pool of funds to spend towards them. So I guess the only question there is the part about the board deciding not to fund them but still leaving them in the pooled schedule. If they're in the schedule, they are naturally part of the overall calculations and they are factored into that process, or at least they should be. There's a follow-up question there. If there are any unspent money in the general budget at year end, does Florida statute direct where they go? It's a good question, and I'm not totally sure of the answer. That's probably a better question for an attorney, but I've never heard of a specific requirement there. We always say it's a good idea to put those extra funds in reserves. You know, if you've got an operating budget that had a surplus at the end of the year, you know, I guess the simple answer is the last thing you want to do is give that money back to the owners. I know it's a tempting scenario, but there's always going to be a better use of those funds, whether it's putting it in reserves, putting it aside into some emergency fund to pay for something like an insurance deductible or uninsured losses. Again, it's not the board's job to make everybody happy. It's to take care of the community. And I would say that taking a responsible look at where those funds could be used is likely to find at least a couple of good outlets for that. Next question here, if a physical asset's useful life expectancy extends beyond a 30-year life, i.e. a new seawall, is that then considered in a different category, and is the maintenance of it a reserve item instead? So this kind of speaks to, again, that 30-year timeline of expenses. And in the event you have a component that has a useful life that would show its eventual replacement happening beyond the 30 years, that does not mean that you don't fund for it. So I'll just use an example. Let's say it is a seawall and you give it a 40-year useful life. If you only start funding for its eventual replacement when the timeline falls within 30 years, again, by then it would be 10 years old. Right? So if you've got a 10-year-old seawall with a 40-year useful life, in the 30th year of your plan, you'll see that replacement. But if you only start funding for it then, you've missed out on the prior 10 years when you could have been saving for it. And again, from the beginning of this class where we talked about funding as thinking of it as paying a current bill of deterioration, as soon as an asset is in place, regardless of how long its life should be, if there's a time when you know it's going to need to be replaced, you should start funding for it, because then you're spreading the cost over a longer period of time and over a larger group of owners who will be there to contribute towards it. Let's see. Next one up here. A significant allocation was made for replacing a roadway, which is in pretty good shape, but requires less costly maintenance. Can the board extend the life expectancy of the roadway and reallocate those monies for other projects that are badly needed? Yes, the short answer there is yes. So let's say you had been planning and assuming your roads were going to need to be done sometime in the next 2 years. And you go out, you do a survey, they look okay. You know, there's not as much deterioration as you had initially thought. There's other high priority things coming up on the list. It's absolutely fine to prolong the life of that roadway, thereby pushing its replacement or resurfacing out into the future, which then kind of frees up more money to be spent on something more important. So, you know, I gave the example in the class of a parking lot versus a cooling tower. You know, which is more important to a condo building? Definitely the cooling tower. So just because something occurs sooner in a reserve funding plan does not naturally make it the higher priority. You can absolutely still use that money for other things that may need it. Okay. Follow-up question, should key items such as electrical replacement or plumbing replacement be part of the reserve study within the annual budget? So there's kind of a question within a question there. We just had a $12,000 repair to an electric line from one of 16 buildings to the FPL transformer. We're hearing this is not unusual. So I talked about this a little bit in our first class, the fundamentals class, how we define a reserve component. Part of the criteria for including something in a reserve study and a reserve funding plan is that it has to have a predictable nature to it. And in most cases, utilities, you know, electrical infrastructure, plumbing, it does not have a predictable nature to it. It's very difficult for us to estimate the scope and frequency of spending that will go towards those projects. They don't last forever, but the question is how much and how often. Particularly with plumbing, you know, we definitely know that buildings are going to have plumbing leaks over time. But our kind of first response would be to include some funding in the operating budget for those things. That's usually going to be a more practical way to go about it, is you deal with hopefully small problems as they come up, you fix them and you move on. If you do that on an ongoing basis, then hopefully you'll keep your plumbing system in a healthy capacity, and you shouldn't, you know, ideally ever need to do a full repiping or relining of your building. Now that can be required, and sometimes, unfortunately, a special assessment is the most appropriate response. Because let's say that you just arbitrarily assume that, you know, in year 50 you're going to have to repipe your whole building. If you do that, if you base your assumptions on that and you start funding for that, and you get to year 50 and it doesn't need to be done, well, you know, now you've essentially overcharged the owners for all that. That was overly conservative. So the best course of action there is to talk with maybe a mechanical engineer, an electrical engineer, have them come out, do a diagnosis of your utility systems, and then, you know, ask them the question, you know, what is the lifespan of this equipment? Do we need to fund for a complete replacement at some point? And if so, what kind of cost are we looking at? Then you can sort of work that into your plan accordingly. But to go into a brand new building and make an arbitrary call that the utilities will last 40 or 50 years is probably not very accurate. Okay, great question here. What should the ratio of the operating budget be to the reserve budget? Now this is going to be a different answer depending on the type of community. So you can imagine that in an HOA community, the association takes care of less things, right? You might have a road, a gate, a clubhouse, a swimming pool area, but the actual homes within the community are the owner's responsibility. Compared to a condo, where the association takes care of almost everything, you know, other than really the airspace inside a particular unit, the association takes care of almost everything else on the property. So it'll be a different answer for different types of communities. But what we've seen is that, statistically speaking, the associations that are in a good position with respect to reserves, the ones that are above 70% funded, when we look at how much of those annual budgets go to reserves, the typical range is between 15 and 40% of the budget. Okay, so you can think about that for your own community. You know, if you have $1 million budget, what we've seen is that normally a healthy amount of reserve contributions could be between $150,000 to $400,000. It's a lot of money. Basically, reserves should be, if not the single biggest line item in the budget, definitely in the top 2 or 3. Okay, that's the list of the preliminary questions. Now I'm going to try to get to some of these other ones on the fly here, and we'll go through this this process here. Okay. Okay, there's a good one here, and I apologize in advance. Some of these that might be very specific to your situation, those might be better served with a phone call or an email, so feel free to reach out to me after the fact. I'm going to try to pick and choose the questions that might be the most relevant to the group as a whole. So the first one I see here, do all Florida HOAs start with the straight line method and a vote is needed to go to the pooled method, or can they start with the pooled method straight away? Yes, to my knowledge, the association can start with the pooled method. You know, I guess it comes down to how the developer sets that up initially. We highly recommend doing it that way. If you have any say in the matter, I would say from the get-go, you should try to get into the pooled method. That typically does require that you have you know, a reserve study done or somebody that's at least familiar enough with the calculations to design that initial budget. But I don't believe there's any requirement that an association, whether condo or HOA, start with straight line. You know, post 2002, the pooled method has been approved, and you can certainly start with that way if at all possible. Let's see.
Hey, Will, I noticed they stated there that I said the unit owner should vote to switch, and you said that it was a board vote. I could be wrong. Can you clarify that for me?
Yeah, exactly. So creating a new pooled reserve account for incoming money is a board decision. Moving existing old money that has already been collected into that new pool of funds for accounting purposes, that requires the vote of the owners.
Okay.
So
Yes, that is what I thought. I might have said it improperly, but yes, if there's a roof reserve that's been straight lined and you're going to move it, the unit owners have to vote. But if you're going to start a new one, the board can do it. Okay, great. Thank you for that.
sure. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's a little bit tricky, and that's why I say you want to speak with your CPA, with your attorney, with your manager. Make sure that everybody understands how that process works. But the good news is that it's a one-time thing. Once you've created your pool of funds and the owners approve to put all the old straight line money into that pool, then that's a done deal. You don't have to redo that every year.
Awesome.
Yeah. Let me see what else we got here. Here's one. What factors or adopted financial strategies would result in a precipitous drop, say 20% or more, in a fully funded percentage between successive reserve studies? Interesting question. There could be a number of things going on there. The first thing that comes to mind is how much time has gone by. You know, if a community does a reserve study, say 10 years ago, and they haven't been funding according to the plan that was initially prepared. It could be that, you know, costs have inflated over those 10 years and they haven't been keeping up with those costs. So now when you do a present day calculation of reserve fund strength, they might have dropped quite a bit from their prior position. Because again, it's not enough to just be in a strong position now. You have to contribute enough money to sustain that position over time. Otherwise, you know, it could be that the two reserve studies were not using the same component lists. You know, if you have two different providers, one who left certain things out, and then the second reserve study is including those things that maybe should have been in there all along, that would definitely explain some of the difference too. There's a greater sum of cost that's being considered there, and therefore a greater number of contributions that would need to be made to meet those needs. But yeah, that's an interesting one. I think, you know, look at how much time has gone by. Did the two reserve studies assume the same kind of apples to apples component list? From there, you know, were there some substantial reductions in the reserve account balance? Were reserves approved to be used for some other purpose, like, you know, paying an insurance deductible or something like that, where they're now in a lower cash position than they were before? How often should a reserve analysis be done? Pretty short answer there. In Florida, it's totally up to the community. Florida does not mandate reserve studies at any particular timeline. It's I would say a best practice to do them every 3 or 4 years. In certain states where they are required, California is a great example. It's every 3 years. You have to have an update with a site visit. State of Virginia is every 5. There's a number of states now where they do have specific intervals, but in Florida, it's up to the board. But I would say best practice is every 3 or 4 years. Let's see here. With pooled reserves, can you still opt for a couple line items for the largest and long-term items, such as roof replacement or street paving? One large number makes it easy for people to think we are fine and can spend on current issues. We are underfunded, older people fearing higher fees, so I worry about having a few million in 15 years. Yeah, I can kind of read between the lines there, and that's not at all uncommon. Obviously, if you're going to fudge the numbers and you're going to remove certain things from the analysis and say, those will be somebody else's problem down the road, or we'll fund for this basket of things and special assess for those, I don't really think that's a successful strategy. I mean, you're just kind of sweeping something under the rug. And if that's the case, then yeah, I mean, there should be some concern that in the future you won't be in a strong enough position. And again, going back to one of the early slides, there's only a couple of ways to fund for these things. They are inevitable. So it's either reserves, special assessments, loans, or do nothing and accept the drop in property value. So if you're concerned that your plan is not comprehensive and then it's not using realistic numbers, that's definitely something to be anxious about. I don't blame you for that. Let's see. And I'm doing my best to try to answer these without having thought about them in advance. I'm seeing these questions on the fly, so bear with me if I take a second here. Here's one: pool funding.
Here's an interesting one, Will.
Yeah,
can you
go
pay
ahead.
for a reserve study from a pooled reserve account? Never seen that one.
Yeah, it's not usually done. I mean, to me, the fees for what a reserve study costs should come out of the operating budget for the most part. Of course, if you have planned for it, if you've listed that as a reserve component in your own budget, where you say, okay, it's every 4 years we're going to spend X amount of money on a reserve study, and you're funding for that in reserves, then sure, you can. There's no legal objection to that. I mean, I personally, I think it's a little self-serving if a reserve study company puts their own fees into the plan and says,
exactly,
you have to fund for this.
Right.
I've seen it done, but generally, we don't do that, and I don't think most companies do that. It's also not a huge sum of money. I mean, particularly update studies are a fraction of the cost of the original ones. So, you're talking about a few $1,000s every couple years at most for most communities. So it's not a massive amount. Normally, I would say it should be in the operating funds.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Let's see. Okay. If a reserve study, for instance, listed lighting entranceway at $5,000 in 2020, and there were expenditures in 2020 that repaired or replaced the entranceway lighting, how do homeowners go about requesting that the board use reserve fund versus operating funds? Interesting question. I guess it depends on the scope of work. So if you are just funding for lighting alone and you did list it in your reserves, then to me it should definitely be a reserve expense first and foremost. If you replace the lighting as a byproduct of doing something else, let's say there was a lightning strike that fried the lights in that area, or you're replacing a monument sign that has lights attached to it and naturally they have to get replaced. If those things weren't listed in your reserves and you're going to pay for those projects out of operating, but as a result of doing them, the lighting also gets replaced, then I guess the kind of begs the question of what would you expect to happen next time? If you would expect that same sort of thing to happen in the future, like if it's a monument sign, maybe you should be funding for the monument signage and include the lighting as part of that. If it's only a $5,000 number to begin with, for most communities, that's kind of on the bubble of whether or not you would even bother to list it in reserves. But I guess the only other defining factor there is that operating money is unrestricted, so you can always spend operating money no matter what. You can only spend reserve money if it's on a specific component that was listed in the schedule. Let's see here. Can the board decide not to pay for expenditures through the reserves that are listed as part of the reserves? That's an interesting one. I guess it kind of depends on the expenditure and what type of community you have. So if it's a condo association, I think you need to go back to statutes which say that you have to have reserves for roofing, painting, pavement resurfacing, and anything over $10,000. So if the project that you're talking about is more than $10,000, then I would say it should be listed in reserves. Now, you could have examples where something is greater than that, but you handle it out of the operating budget. So the best example there is probably landscaping. Landscaping costs for any community can be lots and lots of money each year, but the fact that it's on an annual basis and it's fairly consistent from year to year means that most communities will just budget for landscaping costs on the operating side and not have extra reserve money in reserves for that. So it's if it's a case like that where the association decides, hey, this is a significant project, but we choose to fund it out of operating, I believe you can do that, but you would want to document that and just make sure that from then on, everybody understands that your reserve budget doesn't include that. And that's always going to be paid from operating from then on. Let's see, I've got maybe about 10 more minutes here. Still got over 100 people on the line, so thank you all for joining us. I'm going to try to get through some more of these if we can. Bill, if you see any other good ones that you think might be helpful, feel free to shout those out. Let's see. Just dismissing some of the ones that have already been answered. For a cooperative, is a shareholder vote necessary to determine pooled reserve level, meaning full threshold or baseline, as in vote not to fully fund the pooled reserve? So that's a good question. And we don't deal with a lot of cooperatives. There's just not that many out there compared to condos, but from a budgeting standpoint, they tend to be held to a lot of the same requirements. So I'll just kind of answer as if this was a condo association. Going back to what the state requires. Okay, so the state requires baseline funding. If you want to do less than that, that requires the vote of the owners. Okay, so in other words, the board can propose a budget that is based on a baseline funding objective where they allow it to go down to next to nothing, and that can be approved without any vote of the owners. It's only if the board wants to go below zero at some point, which of course would trigger a special assessment at that point in time, that would be the owner's obligation to vote to approve that. Now, when you have straight line reserves, the definition of fully funding is as we showed it in the calculations. You have cost minus the existing reserves divided by the remaining useful life. Whatever that answer is, that calculation tells you how much to fully fund. In that case, if you have straight line reserves and you want to do less than the full funding number that comes from that calculation, that requires the vote of the owners to approve that. So I know this is confusing, and I wish that they would rewrite the statutes and the administrative code on this, because it's totally inconsistent with how things are normally done or how they should be done. But unfortunately, the answer is it depends on which method you're using. If you have straight line reserves, full funding means one thing. If you have pooled reserves, from the state of Florida's perspective, the owners need to approve anything less than baseline funding. So I hope that answers it. Again, not a position that we agree with. If I could wave a magic wand over the governing laws here, I would say that the owners should have to approve, something that is more appropriate, more healthy to that given association, not just the bare minimum. Okay. If you want to increase the percentage of the annual reserve contribution, can the board decide to just decide, say, 10%? I don't think the board should be arbitrarily making that decision. I mean, I think it should be the result of a formal calculation where you see, what it would take to, fund to 100%, what it would take to baseline fund, and then something in between, the amount of funding required would be determined based on that. Now, sometimes that can be radically different from whatever was done before. You know, it's not, unfortunately, uncommon for us to come in and look at a reserve plan and say, okay, what you've been doing now is woefully inadequate. You really should increase this by a factor of 10. It can be an eye-popping number, but if they've been underfunding all along, then that's the only way to try to get out in front of things and avoid a special assessment down the road. I think it's very, very important to keep in mind that a special assessment should not be a surprise. That is the natural result of having underfunded reserves for some number of years before that. So it's just, that's when the music stops, you got to pay the piper. That's because usually you've enjoyed a number of years when the budget was too low. And again, that's especially unfortunate if you're a newer owner in a community who was not part of those prior years, you know, who got to enjoy those years when the assessments were too low, and now they're being the ones stuck with the bill. And to the extent incoming buyers recognize that as a likely outcome, again, we see that puts a downward pressure on property values in those communities. Okay. Should we send the new reserve study to the membership prior to approving it at a board meeting? I'm in favor of everybody in the community understanding what's going on. I don't need, the term approval of a reserve study really doesn't mean anything. A reserve study doesn't need to be accepted or approved. A board and association has no obligation to follow a reserve study just by having one done. Okay, there's no mandate to accept it or to agree with it. It's just professional advice. So whoever's doing that for you is an independent, objective third party who is just looking at the needs of that community and making some recommendations. Now, having said that, I do think that the ownership should understand what the board is proposing and where it came from. What I hear a lot from board members is that they can get more buy-in to the plan, more likelihood of passing a budget when the owners see all the underlying detail, or at least can understand why it is that way. So we recommend, you know, if you have an association website, you know, if you have like a private side of the website that's for residents only, feel free to put the reserve study up there. Give people a chance to read through it. Oftentimes they have no idea all the different parts and pieces of a property that they actually own a percentage of. You know, if you live in a condo, you own a small percentage of the entire building. So whether that's a tennis court you've never stepped foot on, a roof you've never seen, you know, if you live on the first floor, you still own a percentage of the elevators in that building. So there is no, I don't think there's any reason why you shouldn't, you know, inform the owners, give them a chance to read that over and understand where their money's going. I think that's perfectly fair and reasonable, and, you know, something that they would all benefit from. Okay. I think we've got time for just a couple of more. If we set up a new pool of funds for new projects that are not part of our current straight line reserves, can we use some of that money to have work completed on an existing straight line item that has not been fully funded, but the work is needed ahead of schedule? Kind of a lot to digest there. Complicated situation. I would say that's a good one to run by your accountant to figure out what's the best way to do that. You know, it's not an obvious yes or no. You can have kind of a hybrid situation where you've got a new pool of funds that the board has created, and then some old straight line accounts that you're not putting money into anymore, but the cash is still there to be spent on those projects. So you could think of a situation where you've got a board that says, hey, we want to create a pool of funds. We're going to do that for all of our new money from now on. So 2021 and beyond, all new reserve money is going into the pool. However, if you can't get the vote of the owners to take your old straight line funds and put them into that pool, that money's still sitting there. So what happens in that case is that as those projects come up, let's say it's a painting project, you might have a combination of the old painting straight line bucket of funds. Once you've depleted that, then you would start to pay the difference or the excess from your pooled reserve fund. Again, that's a kind of a complicated situation because you're funding it kind of in two ways, but there is that kind of, that is essentially the way that you convert from straight line to pooled without a vote of the owners, as you just stop funding the old ones and spend down that money until it's gone, then those buckets get thrown away. To keep with the analogy. So now next time around when you paint the building, it will have been funded through the new pool of funds that you've got. Okay. Let's see, real quick. Do you ever attend a community meeting to explain reserves? How much does this cost? That's, I think, a great usage of these videos, to be honest with you. These are going to be up on YouTube in a public format for anybody to see. We're happy to do that. Our website, reservestudy.com, is another great resource for you. We do, I guess we did in the pre-COVID days, do a lot of meetings where we would come out and talk to folks about reserves and kind of handle those on a case-by-case basis, depending on the community. So, we're open to it, but I think before we were to charge you any money, see if you can get some value from these videos, from the articles, the other stuff that we have on our website. So still a lot of great questions on the list here. Apologies, we haven't gotten through all of them, but it's now about 1:30. So I think we'll wrap it up for today. I'll say thanks again to Bill if you want to have any closing remarks, and then we'll let everybody go.
Thank you very much, Will. Thank you all for coming. Very, very informative, and a great job on a very, very difficult subject. Again, we appreciate any feedback you guys can provide for us today.
Oh, you're right. I forgot to launch our poll. Sorry about that.
Okay, I wasn't sure if, so there you go. So there's a survey. We really appreciate your feedback. It's very valuable to us. You're important to us. And again, we thank you so much for coming. And Will, great job on a difficult subject. I learned something every time, as I told a couple people.
Good.
So thank you.
Much appreciated. Yeah, I'll leave the poll up here for just a couple of moments. Looks like people are filling in those questions pretty quick. There's only 4 questions. So thanks again, folks, for doing that. Thanks for hanging in with us. We will have this recorded and posted online very shortly. For you managers out there, we're going to be uploading that credit as soon as we can, and we'll take it from there. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the video and mute myself and just give everyone a couple more minutes to finish out the poll. Other than that, thank you very much, and we'll talk to you next time.
Thank you, Will.
Thanks.